this week we have arrived at chapter 10. And as we have been seeing since chapter 4, we have here yet again a continuation of God laying out the different sins that Israel has committed. You can see that as you begin reading at the beginning of chapter 10, it talks about the sin that Israel committed, which is then going to lead into its captivity. But I want to draw our attention to a few verses as we read chapter 10 and get towards the end. And we're going to begin at verse 11. I remember that when we were talking about Israel and why God was upset is that they left God practicing basically the same cult, meaning the same type of worship that was reserved for God, but instead they were doing it within the fertility religion, right? So they were doing it for the Baals and the Asherahs and the gods of fertility and the like. And so they were doing this because they believed that it was Baal giving them the rains, which then allowed for the land to be fertile and give them food. And so here in verse 11 we have this really interesting tidbit that God gives us. He says, Ephraim was a trained heifer that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck. But I will make Ephraim break the ground. Judah must plow. Jacob must harrow for himself. And so basically God is saying that I was providing for you. I gave you everything you needed without you having to work. I didn't want you to suffer under the yoke of having to grow your own food, or having to suffer before you can have food. But since you think you can do it without me, since you think it was the Baals giving it to you, since you think you're obtaining this food through your fertility rights, I am now going to pull back. And watch what happens. What happens is that you are now going to have to labor and suffer before you can get food on the table. And then it continues. And so God encourages them in verse 12. It says, sow for yourselves righteousness and reap steadfast love. And this is where I want us to really take a moment to think and focus and just hone in on what God is saying. Because the question that I want to ask of all of us is, what are we sowing? God says, sow righteousness and reap steadfast love. Instead, Israel chose to sow wickedness, and the result is that they reaped injustice, it says in verse 13. So the question again that I ask is, what are you sowing? So God calls us to be mindful of how we act, because what we sow will determine what we reap. And then he goes on as the chapter ends. If you read a little bit in verse 14, then it says that there are other powerful forces that are going to come against you when they realize that you are becoming powerful yourself. And so this is not to discourage anyone from achieving success, but be mindful and be aware that when you become successful, there are people who will work to bring you down. There are people who will seek to destroy you. There are people who will seek to make sure that you don't reach a certain level, because power is something that they think is theirs that they don't want to share. It's how it's always been. It's how it's always going to be. So you can't do it on your own. So instead, be there with God. Have God in your corner, so that when the time comes and you are having success, and then there are powers, there are people, there are things that come up against you, you have God to fight for you. But first, you must sow righteousness. Because whatever we sow will determine what we reap. And so I ask all of us again, as we meditate on chapter 10 of the book of Hosea, what are we sowing? So think about that as you come on, and let us get on the way.